Yeah, thank you, sir. So, good afternoon, all. Welcome to our 10th session. Today, we're having a topic on gastrointestinal symptoms, and it will be taken by Dr. Sridevi. So, we can start with ma'am's presentation. We can have it for around 40 to 45 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of discussion. By 4, we can have our case presentation, followed by its discussion. Thank you all for joining in. Over to Sunil, sir.
Thank you, Radhalakshmi. Today, we are going to hear about a gastrointestinal symptom, mainly about constipation, nausea, and vomiting. So, constipation is one symptom which is not properly treated, or rather, it is neglected whenever we hear about constipation. And patients are also not very much convinced about treating constipation. And for nausea and vomiting, now the treatment is it all comes to one medication, ondansetron. That's the panacea for treatment of nausea and vomiting. So let's hear from Dr. Sridevi about how to manage the symptoms. Dr. Sridevi is a palliative care physician who was working with us and presently working as a volunteer in Pallium India. She has been she has worked in other institutions also. She has done her MSc in palliative medicine, and she also has research interest. Welcome, Sridevi, and it's over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Raju, for the introduction. Sir, I have split the presentations today. I'll be talking about nausea and vomiting, and I'll deal with the constipation along with bowel obstruction because the nausea vomiting takes a longer time than the other two. So, is it okay to split it up that way? Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Raju, can you just give me an idea about the participants? Are they from a group from a particular institution or from different places?
All of them are postgraduate students of physical medicine and rehabilitation of Trivandrum Medical College.
Okay. I think I've spoken to them before, right? Yeah, we have had a session. I have met them before. Anyway. So I'll start the presentation from here. I hope everyone can see the presentation.
Yes, ma'am, we can.
So, as Sir was mentioning, we'll be going a little bit deeper in the details of management of nausea and vomiting, because we always tend to prescribe one particular medication or one or two particular medication for managing any kind of nausea and vomiting. And when it comes to palliative care, it is really important to understand the pathophysiology. I'm just stopping the sharing because I think the slide is not moving. Raju, is there anything I think I should enable editing?
Yes, you have to enable editing. Open the screen before.
Yeah, it is there in the. It's opened already, but I think it's not moving. Let me try once more. Is something coming up now?
Not Sridevi. It says Sridevi has started screen sharing, but we can't see it.
Okay. Raju, I think you have to start from there.
Okay, ma'am.
Let me try once more.
Yeah.
Because here it's seeing. I'm sharing, but I think it's not coming onto the screen.
Ma'am, we can do it from our end then, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you. Next slide. So why should we give so much of importance in management of nausea and vomiting? Because we know that like any other symptom, it affects the patient's daily functioning. And like pain and any other symptom, the quality of life is very much hindered, because we know that even if we are nauseous, we don't feel like doing anything, or we don't feel like traveling. And these patients have to travel or go for treatment, or eat properly, that we insist on them. So they are unable to carry out all these things when they have nausea and vomiting. And many times people are really scared to go for cancer treatment just because that they are scared of nausea and vomiting. You might have come across people who might be telling, I'm scared of going through chemotherapy because I can't see other people vomiting, or I don't want to be vomiting. And that's some dreadful symptom that people always talk about when it comes to cancer treatment. And inadequate symptom control, because you are giving your pain medications or your any other medications, and the patient keeps vomiting. So what happens, there is poor absorption of whatever medications that you are giving, and the patients will tell you the symptoms are not adequately controlled. And it increases distress both for patient and the family. If you have a loved one in your family who keeps vomiting, or who keeps telling that I don't want to hear this smell because I tend to have nausea, so it's always a distressing symptom for both patient and the family. Next slide. So this is just a little bit on how prevalent the nausea is. I'm not talking about vomiting here, because nausea is really subjective. We cannot see the patient being nauseous, but patient will keep telling you that I'm feeling nauseous, and the relatives may not give much attention because he's not actually vomiting. Unless you vomit and bring the contents out, people don't really understand what you're going through. So the prevalence is really high. So you can notice it is not just in advanced cancer. You can see the nausea is really a distressful symptom in terms of AIDS, heart disease, and renal disease, although it is higher in terms of advanced cancer. Next slide. So what is the objective of understanding the mechanism of nausea and vomiting, and why should we manage, so that at least we can reduce the frequency? Many a times we may not be able to stop the nausea and vomiting completely, especially nausea, because it is really subjective. So at least to reduce the frequency of vomiting and establish compliance of treatment. So if the patient gets confidence that, okay, I'm not vomiting after chemotherapy, there is a high chance that the patient will continue with the chemotherapy. And it is easy to administer oral medications. We cannot rely on injections all the time. So it's easy to administer oral medication so that the family will be able to take care of him in a better way, and obviously to improve quality of life. Next slide. So just going through the definition, you don't have to remember it, but there is a difference between nausea and vomiting. As you know, nausea is an unpleasant sensation which is purely subjective. It's not an objective, it's not a sign, it is an unpleasant feeling. Often the need to vomit. Usually there will be pallor, cold, sweat, salivation, all these symptoms, but the patient may not actually bring out any contents. But in terms of vomiting, there's forceful expulsion of gastric contents through the mouth. So there is actually something coming out through the mouth, then it is vomiting. Some people may not have nausea before vomiting. Some people will have nausea before vomiting. And as I mentioned in the prevalence, I have mentioned the prevalence of nausea, but I have not mentioned anything about vomiting, because most often it is always seen together, nausea and vomiting as a cluster. Yes,
Sridevi,
sir?
is
Yeah.
there a way to reduce the background noise?
Yeah, I'll just close the door. My kids are having their play there. I'll just close the door. Just give me a minute. Kanna, amma door close cheyane.
Sridevi, please unmute you.
I think it will be better now.
Yeah.
So I have mentioned a little bit about retching. When they report to you, especially in our language Malayalam, we get confused with whether it is nausea or retching, or sometimes they bring up they feel cough along with nausea. So it's a totally confusing symptom. It is very difficult to differentiate between retching and vomiting and nausea. Sometimes we get confused. So retching is a rhythmic, labored, spasmodic movement of the diaphragm and abdominal muscles. It's not necessary that they may bring out the gastric contents through the mouth. It may not be necessary to have a nausea. Next slide. So what are the basic principles of management? You might have gone through the management of pain. So, you know, they might have talked about EMA, the principles of any symptom management. And the baseline of any management, any symptom management is correcting the correctable. So understand why the patient is vomiting. What is the cause of vomiting? And before jumping into any other medication, try non-pharmacological measures, especially in nausea and vomiting, and dietary modifications. And understand why, as I mentioned, understand why the patient is vomiting, what is the cause of vomiting, understand what are the receptors involved in this vomiting. And according to the receptors involved at various sites, choose the appropriate antiemetics. There is no single formula for controlling nausea and vomiting. Understand the receptor, understand where it is acting, what is causing nausea and vomiting, and block the receptors there. So that is the ideal way to manage nausea and vomiting. Next slide. So I'll start with the non-pharmacological measures, because we often tend to neglect the non-pharmacologic measures which can be done at home. Rather, we jump into medication very often. And even though you are prescribing medications, it is better to explain to them how can we control these symptoms by without using much of the drugs. Avoid situations in which can induce nausea and vomiting. So many a times people will tell that I cannot tolerate the smell of cooking, or other people eating this particular food in front of me, or I cannot see some kind of food. So avoid a situation which can cause nausea and vomiting. And calm, reassuring environment, which may not be possible when they are coming to a hospital like a regional cancer center or a medical college. We cannot give the calm and reassuring environment, but at home, if possible, give them a space which has a fresh air and good sunlight, so that they have a good fresh air to breathe in, and there is a calm environment. And upright position, not lying down all the time. Most often we might be seeing patients who will keep vomiting and they keep lying down. So the positioning is also very important in non-pharmacologic measures. Next slide. Good oral hygiene. Oral hygiene is a really important part. When someone keep vomiting for a long period of time, there will be halitosis inside the mouth, and there can be stomatitis. And when they are sick or when they are admitted in a hospital, they don't tend to give a good care of oral cavity. They think that they are patient, and it is very common. I'm not telling out of one or two cases, but it is very common that they stop looking after their oral cavity, especially when they have nausea and vomiting. Because when you think about brushing, they start nauseating. So it's very important to keep a good oral hygiene and control of malodor. Suppose a patient with a huge wound in the head and neck cancer, or who is having a colostomy, or who is having a bed sore, we ourselves feel nauseating, right? Because of the foul smell. So what if the patient is lying with that wound 24 hours, 365 days? So it's really important, if at all possible, to control the foul smell from fungating wound, or a bed sore, or a colostomy bag if they have that. And suitable distractors. Try to use some distractors, like some people would like to talk to others, some people would like to listen to music, or some people would just want to lie down a little bit without thinking anything else. And our relatives will be keeping on insisting of having food. Why can't you have a little bit of kanji? Why can't you have a little bit of juice? So keep avoid all those things and keep suitable distractors. Next slide. And it is really important to give frequent small meals. It is also important in terms of management of anorexia or cachexia. People don't, especially in terms of advanced illness, and if they have nausea and vomiting, they don't want anything to eat. But as a caregiver, our job will be to feed the patient so that he will feel better. It's really important to give small, frequent meals. Reduce the size of meals. Give a big plate and a small portion. Make it more attractive. Some people would want to have fish or chicken. Then they keep asking you, can I have fish? It's okay. He cannot have more than a piece or two. So it's okay to have whatever he wants to have. But keep it small. Keep the size really small. And don't keep it like 3 times a day, full meal 3 times a day. Rather than that, it's better to give small frequent meals, maybe 1 hour in between, keeping a break, and give small meals. So you may be able to take a very few sips every hour. So that's fine. Avoid sweet, spicy, carbonated drinks. Very often people would want to drink Coke, especially when they have some stomach upset. It is okay to have a sip or two, but not more than that. And many people tell that they would want bland food and clear fluids, kanji or just plain water would be fine. If that is what they can eat, that's fine. But give small frequent meals. Next slide. So we'll move on to the pharmacological measures next. So this would be really boring because I'll be talking a lot about receptors and the pathways of vomiting. Even after the presentation, I'll be sharing the presentation. You can go through the slides and understand. Once you get the idea of all the centers and receptors and the drugs, it's really good to play with the drugs and to understand why this patient is vomiting, which center would be involved and which drugs to be used, and you can really see the difference in management of nausea and vomiting. So you have to remember 5 key players in this game. So these are the 5 key players. Of course, the vomiting center in the cerebral cortex is the manager of this game, which is situated in the cerebral cortex, and the 4 other members would be CTZ, GIT, vestibular nucleus, and cerebral cortex. So just remember 5 key players, and we'll move on to one by one. Next slide. So we'll start with the vomiting center. What exactly and where exactly is this vomiting center? So it's not a specific anatomic structure per se, but it is located in the lateral reticular formation of medulla, and it is a diffuse. It's basically an interconnecting neural network, and it has a lot of complex mechanisms. That's why we breathe a lot, we sweat a lot, we become pale when you have nausea and vomiting. So it's really a complex interconnecting neural network, not exactly an anatomical location where you can say, okay, this is vomiting center. Next would be chemoreceptor trigger zone, which is really important. It is a structure located at near the 4th ventricle. And the important thing to remember is that it is positioned outside the blood-brain barrier. So what happens? It is accessible to most of the substances in the blood or cerebral CSF. As it is placed outside the blood-brain barrier, it is accessible to most of the substances in the blood. That means the drugs you are giving, the bacteria, whatever you are giving, which reaches the blood, it can reach the chemoreceptor trigger zone. And it's area postema, but it is commonly known as CTZ or chemoreceptor trigger zone. Next slide. And next comes the proximal bowel or stomach. It has mediators from the enterochromaffin cells. It can stimulate the vagal and splanchnic nerves within the bowel wall. And from there, the signals are conducted directly to the brainstem through the nucleus tractus solitarius. I'm not going into the details because you will be familiar with the physiological or anatomical part of it. And there comes the cerebral cortex. It is mainly, the cerebral cortex mainly deals with your memory, your fear. So for example, as a kid, you might have vomited several times when you have traveled in a car. So next time when you think about a car journey, you remember that you have vomited. So that can induce vomiting. So that's a higher input from the cerebral cortex. Vestibular nucleus, you all will be familiar because input from the vestibular nucleus mainly deals with balance and movement. So it is mainly when people say that when I get up, I have vomiting or I feel nauseous when I change the head position, which is very commonly seen in general practice. So we have heard about 5 major players in managing, in mediating the nausea and vomiting. Next slide. So this is pretty confusing when you hear it for the first time. It was confusing for me when I heard it for the first time. I don't know how far it is not confusing. I tried to simplify it as much as possible. So these are the main receptors involved in the pathway of nausea and vomiting. The very important one is dopamine. So we all know that there are several types of dopamine receptors starting from D1 to D5. So my interest would be to focus on D2 because it manages, if you understand where D2 is and how to block the D2 receptors, you got it well. So D2 receptors are situated in the CTZ and also D3. So these D2 receptors are seen in the CTZ as well as in the stomach. So 2 sides. And if you know what are the drugs, what are the potent drugs which can block the D2 receptors, you pretty much cover in terms of palliative care, patients in palliative care. So the next group of receptors are serotonin receptors, and we all know that 5-HT1 to 5-HT4. And in this, I would like to focus mainly on 5-HT3 and 5-HT4. 5-HT3 is mainly seen in the gut as well as in the CTZ as well as in the nucleus of tractus solitare. So it is everywhere, literally. And 5-HT4 is seen only in the GI. You cannot memorize all these things, but just get familiar with the receptors, especially dopamine, serotonin, neurokinins, and other neurotransmitters. So in terms of dopamine, I'm repeating, there is D1 to D5, and we have to give stress to focus more on D2 and D3, because that is the most common thing that we want to deal with. Serotonin, and we focus mostly on 5-HT3 and 5-HT4. I'm not telling not other receptors are not needed, but just to make it easier. And there are other receptors like tachykinins and neurokinins. Substance P, neurokinase A and B. I'm not just reading out everything. And other neurotransmitters like histamine, anti-acetylcholine, GABA, cannabinoids. So there are numerous number of receptors that are involved in the mechanism of nausea and vomiting. So if you understand when a patient is vomiting, where this is coming from, which receptor is playing here, and which player in the 5 players is present there, it is easy to manage. Next slide. So again, first time when you see that, when I saw this diagram, I got totally confused. But when you see it again and again, and if you have that handy, it is easier. So in this, I have mentioned every possibilities in palliative care act on which receptors. If you go to the left upper part of the diagram, you can see what happens in chemotherapy, for example. It's very common. See, so chemotherapy, which one is involved? 5-HT3 in the gut wall, 5-HT3 in the CTZ. So when there is a chemotherapy-induced vomiting, you have to block 5-HT3 in the gut wall as well as in the CTZ. So where is the morphine? You can see that from next to the chemotherapy in the upper part of the diagram, you can see morphine or digoxin or any other drugs like that. Morphine acts at the D2 in the CTZ, right? So you have to block the D2. So once you understand this diagram, fear and anxiety, can everyone see the fear and anxiety part in that? So where exactly it is playing? It is playing in the cerebral cortex. So if we can block the neurokinin 1, GABA or 5-HT, which are the receptors in the cerebral cortex, it is easy to manage the fear and anxiety-induced vomiting. So once you understand this picture, and I want everyone to understand this and take a note of whatever it is, because I have questions in the end of the presentation and I will be asking you which receptors are involved. So I think it will keep you from sleeping, keep you away from sleeping. Next slide. Again, coming to the boring part of the receptors, we can see what in the vomiting center, which all receptors are present, in the CTZ, which all receptors are present, and in the cerebral cortex, which all receptors are present, and what are the drugs that can be used to block these receptors. So coming to the vomiting center, you have muscarinic, antihistaminic, and 5-HT2 receptor and neurokinin receptors. And in the CTZ, you have D2, 5-HT. So it is literally the written down part of the last diagram. So you will know what are receptors are present in each center. You cannot by heart it. I still find it difficult. So I keep the diagram, which is in the previous slide, handy, so that you will understand which receptors are present in which all areas. Next slide. Again, there are another class of antiemetics which is prokinetics. So I'll come into detail, so that's why I'm skipping through these slides, but just to make you understand what are the drugs involved in the management of vomiting. You have prokinetics like metoclopramide, which is a very commonly known prokinetic. You have anti-secretory drugs which will reduce the secretions, which has anticholinergic effects like hyoscine, which we commonly say as Buscopan. You have 5-HT3 receptor blockers which is commonly used, ondansetron and granisetron, and NK1 receptor antagonist, which is aprepitant, which is not commonly used antiemetic. You have anti-inflammatory drugs, which is corticosteroids. So these are the class of antiemetics that we commonly use. The first one is prokinetics. Second one would be anti-secretory. Third one would be this 5-HT3 receptor antagonist. And the fourth one would be anti-inflammatory. So these are the four main class of drugs that we use in management of vomiting. Next slide. I tried to just enumerate so that it can become simple. So all starts with M. 10 M's in the 10 M's which can cause vomiting. The first M would be metastasis. So any metastasis to the brain or the liver can cause vomiting. Is it clear? Any metastasis to brain or liver. So when there is a metastasis to brain, there will be raised ICT, and liver, obviously the stretch of liver capsule can cause nausea and vomiting. I'll come to the drugs again later, but you can see what are the drugs that can be used. So when you have a metastasis to the brain, there is raised ICT. So what we use steroids and mannitol to reduce the cerebral edema. When there is a meningeal mets, leptomeningeal, again there is a raised ICT, so we use steroids. And in between, I have mentioned which all areas are involved in this particular reason. So next M would be medication. What are the medications that can cause vomiting? Opioids, the opioids that we use, morphine, although it is reversible in the beginning, in the initial few days, it can cause nausea and vomiting. And the third column I have mentioned, what are the centers involved in this opioid mediated vomiting. And the fourth column, you can see what are the drugs that can be used in opioid-induced nausea and vomiting. The primary drugs to block D2 receptors would be metoclopramide and haloperidol. The second would be of interest because most of our patients would have chemotherapy-induced vomiting, and why? It is mediated through 5-HT3, which is present in the GI tract as well as in the CTZ. So we have to block the 5-HT3. So what is the 5-HT3 blocker? Ondansetron or any other cetrons, any cetron, palanosatron, granisetron, whatever drugs in that class. Just a moment, I'll just close the door. I think there is again background.
Close the door when you go out.
So there are three classes of drugs primarily that we see in palliative care: opioids and the chemotherapeutic agents and the NSAIDs. We use a lot of NSAIDs, especially ibuprofen, which can cause GI irritation. And as we said, whatever drugs in the blood can reach the CTZ. So if we have to block the vomiting, we have to block the receptors in the CTZ as well as in the GI tract. Next. So there are 10 M's to go. We covered 3. Next is movement. Any movement, obviously vestibular center, the drug to be used will be a promethazine usually, or any other antihistamine or anticholinergic drugs. Mentation, M, because there is an anxiety-induced vomiting. Memory, you have vomited once during chemotherapy, so you are just anxious about vomiting the next time. So usually the GABA receptors play there, and you can block it with lorazepam. Next time would be mechanical. Whenever there is constipation, any tumor or any stretching, any metastasis to the lumen, there is a mechanical cause for nausea and vomiting. So what should we do? We should manage the constipation. We should manage the bowel obstruction. Next. So the next term would be metabolic. Whenever there is hyponatremia or hypercalcemia or liver failure, there is nausea and vomiting, which is mediated through CTZ. So usually CTZ, there are 5-HT3 antagonists and D2 receptor antagonists, usually managed through correction of whatever cause, correction of hypercalcemia, hyponatremia, correction of whatever metabolic causes that you have seen, and ondansetron and sometimes dexamethasone. Next time would be motility. So these are the medications that can cause a problem in the motility. For example, you have heard about morphine can cause reduce the gastric movement. So opioids, ileus, or any other medication that can affect the motility, usually we give a prokinetic to improve the motility. Other mucosal causes can be the drugs that you give, especially NSAIDs, or someone having GERD can cause mucosal irritation. Then we have to give antacids or any other cytoprotectives. Microbes, any microbes in the oral cavity, especially candidiasis, can cause nausea, and we often neglect, or any other big mouth ulcers which are infected. So in that, the treatment would be topical antifungal. I'm enumerating all the causes because you can you cannot by heart it or anything, but you will understand how each one is different. When you have a mucosal issue with an NSAID, it is quite different from when you have a candidiasis induced vomiting. You will just see the patient vomiting and you don't know why he's vomiting. So you have to think whether it is due to the NSAIDs that you prescribe. Then what is the management? Or is it because that the patient is having an oral thrush? Then the treatment is totally different. You cannot give your ondansetron or any antacids when the patient is having a candidal infection. You have to give antifungals. If the patient is having a metastasis and spread to the brain, no metoclopramide or haloperidol or anything would be helpful. You have to use mannitol or steroid to reduce the intracranial tension. So this table is just to make you understand that how the cause is different in terms of vomiting, and how should we choose the medication. This is not to enumerate what all drugs to be given or what all things to be done, that you can read later, but just understand what is the importance of this. How should we differentiate the reasons for vomiting and how should we prescribe? Next slide. So, as I mentioned before, thorough assessment. Why? What medication he is taking? Is there any factor at home which is causing vomiting? Is there a fungating ulcer which is having a foul smell which is causing vomiting? Is there a colostomy bag which is creating a foul smell? Is there a sepsis? So assessment is really, really important. Correct the correctable. If he has hypercalcemia or hyponatremia, correct the cause. Then you may not need to give medication for a long period of time. You just correct the correctable, the nausea or vomiting will be subsided. Manage the complication and provide targeted therapy. It's really important to choose. I always emphasize on the word appropriate. You have to choose appropriate antiemetic. It is not just choosing some or the other antiemetic that you find as fancy, but it is important to choose the appropriate antiemetic. Appropriate route. Someone is vomiting, I cannot give an oral medication because the patient is going to vomit it out. So choosing the appropriate route. If I am choosing an IV route and the patient is not willing for admission, I cannot prescribe an IV medication and come out of the home. So choosing the appropriate route according to the patient's situation is really important. Attention to details, the nature of vomiters, the timing, the frequency, all those details are really important. What are medications the patient is on? What are the factors that can cause all this? So the details are really important. Next slide. This is very basic things that we go through, that we do for any symptom. You have to assess the duration of vomiting, quality. Is it associated with nausea? Is it associated with retching? Is there a regurgitation? What is the intensity of vomiting? What is the nature of vomiters? You cannot just say that vomiting. You have to understand what is the amount of vomiting. Is it a large volume vomiters? Is it bilious? Is it green colored vomiters? Is it a fecal vomiters? So you have to understand what is the quality of vomiters. Is there any associated pain? Is there any? Sometimes patients will tell you, I had a severe pain when I vomited, the pain went off. So you have to get an understanding what all things it is associated with. Is there any altered bowel habit? Is it aggravated by sight and smell of food? Is it worse after eating something, or is it worse in the morning? And what relieves? For example, I had a blotting sensation. When I vomited, I felt relieved. So you have to understand what are the associated other symptoms. Drug history is really, really important because many of the drugs that we prescribe can cause vomiting, especially opioids, NSAIDs. Many of the antibiotics can cause vomiting. Anti-cancer treatment is very, very prone. As you know, many of the chemotherapeutic agents are very notorious in causing vomiting. And coming to the physical, so I'm trying to tell you that when you assess, when you are treating a patient with nausea and vomiting, it is really important, like you assess pain. When you see a patient with pain, you go through the PQRSTU, the palliating, precipitating factors and everything. So it's really important in management of every other symptom. The quality, the intensity, duration, palliating and provoking factors, everything is important when you assess the reasons for nausea and vomiting. Go to the physical examination, check whether there is any organomegaly, because for example, I have mentioned liver capsular stretch, that when there is a hepatomegaly, it can irritate and it can push the diaphragm, and patient will tell you pain, patient will tell you vomiting, distension. So it's very important to examine the abdomen. Look for organomegaly, look for bowel sounds, whether there is a exaggerated bowel sounds, whether there is no bowel sounds. It's really important to understand, because when it comes to the management of obstruction, the bowel sounds really matters. And rectal examination whenever needed. And check for other signs of sepsis or any hypotension, any metabolic abnormalities, and any neurological signs. Usually we don't need much of the investigations, but when it comes to the obstruction, we may need an abdominal X-ray. And check the blood for sepsis, renal failure, or any other hypercalcemia, hyponatremia, or anything. So check the laboratory tests. Next slide. So I'll just go through a few drugs that we use very commonly in palliative care. The most commonly used drug would be metoclopramide. I won't be reading each and everything mentioned in the slide. It is a D2 antagonist and 5-HT4 agonist. Usually we give up to 100 milligram or over 24 hours at a higher doses. At a higher doses, it blocks 5-HT3. So previously, before all this granisetron or ondansetron was used, they used to use higher doses of metoclopramide for chemotherapy-induced vomiting. But when you use higher doses for a longer period of time, there is a chance of extrapyramidal side effects. So with the advent of all these 5-HT3 antagonists like ondansetron, it is a preferred drug than metoclopramide for chemotherapy-induced vomiting. So the major effect is the prokinesis, because it acts, it triggers the cholinergic system in the wall of the gut. And you know that when you give opioid blocks everything. There is a kind of gastric stasis. So you need a prokinetic to push the gastric movements to happen. So you use prokinetic agents. So the important action of metoclopramide is prokinesis, and it acts at B2 and 5-HT4. At higher doses, it acts at 5-HT3. And I don't know whether you remember, I mentioned that the B2 receptors are present in the CTZ and in the gut wall and in the brain. And metoclopramide has proven to be most effective in the D2 receptors in the gut wall than in the brain. And I'm sure that you will be familiar with the term dopamine brake. The metoclopramide block the dopamine brake. For example, I'll just tell you in the layman language. You have a car driving and dopamine has put on a brake, so the car is not moving anymore. So the bowel is not emptying anymore. And when you give a metoclopramide, the brake is released. Your leg is removed from the brake, so there is a more chance of gastric emptying and kinesis. Next slide. And pharmacokinetics, I'm not going to read each and every one of it, but bioavailability is better. And people are really scared about extrapyramidal side effects. It's not that common, although it is not uncommon, but it is usually seen in higher doses. Usually we don't go to that doses, and we have seen 1 or 2 cases maybe in many years, but not more than that. Next slide. You have to be really cautious when you give in patients with, I may say, epilepsy, but very commonly in Parkinson's disease, because it actually exacerbates the symptoms in Parkinson's disease. And when you have a complete obstruction, you should be really, you should not be giving metoclopramide, because the bowel is completely obstructed and you are pushing the bowel to move forward. It can cause gastric perfection. So complete bowel obstruction, you cannot give metoclopramide. And don't combine metoclopramide with drugs like Buscopan, because both has opposite actions. So there is no point in giving both drugs together. I'm not reading line by line. You can read it later, but everything is mentioned about the drug in this slide. Next slide. So a few things to remember about metoclopramide: D2 receptor blocking, 5-HT3 in a higher dose, and 5-HT4 receptor blocking. Mainly, it is a prokinase. It acts as a prokinetic agent, and it is very commonly used drug, especially in morphine-induced vomiting. So next would be domperidone, which is another commonly used, but it is not very commonly used in palliative care setting. It does not cause cross blood-brain barrier, and it has a dual antiemetic effect. It is not commonly used in palliative care because we have a more potent blocker like metoclopramide. It also counteracts the dopamine brake. The side effects are less than when you compare to metoclopramide in terms of domperidone, but metoclopramide is a more potent blocker. Next slide. Again, pharmacokinetics, bioavailability is less, so it's better after food. Oral doses are not that effective as the systemic. Again, it cannot, as it is a has a prokinetic action, it cannot be given when you are suspecting a complete bowel obstruction. Next slide. These are the other drugs which is used in palliative care. You may not be using it any other setting, but commonly used in palliative care. The first drug would be haloperidol, which is an antipsychotic, a drug which you know is a typical antipsychotic, but it is a pure D2 receptor blocker, especially in the cortex, in the centrally acting D2 receptor blocker. Usually the doses are 1.5 milligram, very low dose than that we use in delirium. It can be given through mouth. And it is very lower doses than the antipsychotic dose. It is a more potent blocker when you need to block the D2 receptor in a central level. It has less effect in the D2 receptors in the CTZ. So it is most commonly used when you have to block it centrally. Olanzapine is another atypical antipsychotic drug which you might have seen in psychiatry practice, but it is a very broad spectrum antiemetic drug. It is very good in blocking D1, D2, and D4, and most of the receptors it blocks, like serotonin, dopamine, and alpha-1 adrenergic, histaminic, cholinergic receptors. Only problem is that it can induce sleep. We need only a very small dose when it comes to antiemetic effect. We generally start with 2.5 milligram or 5 milligram once. Usually we give it at night because it can cause sleep. Long-term use can cause weight gain also. So olanzapine is another broad spectrum antiemetic. Levomipramycin, I don't think it is available in our setting, so I may not be explaining it, but it is, of course, blocks a lot of receptors and it is a very good antiemetic. Next slide. These are the other drugs. Steroids, we know that it is another broad spectrum antiemetic. Along with that, when you have a cerebral edema or when you have a liver enlargement, you need to reduce the edema. So you need something to reduce the peritumor edema. That is where we use corticosteroids. When it is used purely for antiemetic effect, you can use anywhere from 4 milligram. But if your intention is to reduce the peritumor edema, the doses can range anywhere from 4 to 16 milligram. And if it is used for reducing raised intracranial pressure, we may have to use much, much higher doses. That we will deal with when we talk about the bowel obstruction next week. Octreotide the previous slide. So octreotide is another class of drug which is a VIP substance. It is very commonly used drug in many of the hospital setting because it's pretty expensive. It is very commonly drug which is used in malignant bowel obstruction. Again, octreotide will be mentioned in detail in management of bowel obstruction. Hyoscine, the commonly used drug is Buscopan. The main action is that it will reduce all the secretion, it relaxes the smooth muscle. So anticholinergic and antimuscarinic effects. So it basically dries up all the secretions and makes the gut silent. The usual dose would be 60 to 120 milligram. The oral absorption is really, really poor. So if you are administering, it is better to administer subcutaneous or intravenous. We don't have cannabinoids. That's why I have put it in a very small font. But it is very commonly used in other countries for management of nausea and vomiting. And when you have anxiety-induced vomiting, we know that GABA is a receptor involved, and we know that benzodiazepine would be the class of drugs that can be useful. Next slide. So I know that it is pretty confusing when it comes to nausea and vomiting. I have struggled a lot to understand this when I heard it for the first time. So I have coming across with a patient story, and we'll walk through his experience through the vomiting and nausea. So this is a 56-year-old male with carcinoma colon, and he's coming to you with persistent vomiting. He's telling you that we'll go through different scenarios. Next slide. So the same male, we'll be talking about this 56-year-old male with CA colon. And he's telling you that I have a colicky abdominal pain, and I feel that I have bloated feeling, and whatever I am vomiting is greenish color, and I have not passed stools for 1 week. So what would be the reason? Just avoid this. I don't want the receptors or anything involved in this, but what can be the reason for this vomiting? I would like to hear from you, then only I can proceed. So I told you keep your eyes and ears open. I'll be asking questions. So what can be the reason for this vomiting? Yes, someone?
Can be intestinal obstruction.
Yeah, it can be intestinal obstruction. Thank you. Next slide. So it's so he may be feeling okay most of the time. Usually nausea, depending on severity of obstruction. Usually this kind of vomiting, they feel better after vomiting because everything is accumulated, and usually takes an hour after a meal. After taking food, it takes after some time they start vomiting. Next slide. And this is obstruction. There will be stretch, and I'm not going into details because we have one full session on obstruction, and I have mentioned about the receptors involved in that and what to do. Next. So when there is an obstruction, we need to reduce the tumor edema. So we need a steroid to reduce tumor edema. If it is a partial obstruction, we may need a prokinetic, as I mentioned. We need a metoclopramide or a domperidone. And for gastric irritation, because sometimes people will tell you that along with the obstruction, you may have gastric irritation also. You may have to give omeprazole or pantoprazole or sucralfate, a gastroprotective also. And stop if there is any drug that is causing the obstruction. Next slide. So the same male, 56-year-old male with CA colon, persistent vomiting, have received chemotherapy 3 days ago, vomiting, and after 3 weeks, he has come to another cycle of chemotherapy. Again, he is vomiting. He has not just started chemotherapy. So what can be the reasons when he is vomiting 3 days after chemotherapy? And what can be the reason why he is vomiting when he just came to the daycare for another cycle of chemotherapy? Anyone? It's easy. You all will be seeing
anxiety.
this.
Anxiety also can cause.
Exactly. So after chemotherapy, obviously the chemotherapeutic agents reaching the 5-HT3 receptors and reaching the CTZ and gut wall, causing vomiting. He's coming to the chemotherapy daycare center and he's reminded, okay, last time I vomited a lot. I'm anxious. I still remember that it has happened. So how to deal with that? Next slide. CT's chemotherapeutic agents. So we need to think about the drugs causing vomiting and anxiety and memory, which acts through the cortex. Next slide. Usually, for chemotherapy-induced vomiting, the usual drug would be ondansetron, but nowadays everywhere they use granisetron and palanosetron, which found to be more effective than ondansetron. And when he's anxious about nausea and vomiting, when he comes for chemotherapy, the drug of choice would be any benzodiazepine, preferably lorazepam. Next slide. I'll be finishing off soon. The same person coming to you with history of severe headache and weakness right half of the body, and he has CA colon with vomiting. So what can be the reason? It's the easiest, right? I know that these are the easy options. Yes? Sorry?
Raised intracranial pressure.
Yeah, raised in, so he might have developed, we don't know, he might have developed a cerebral mets or a meningeal mets, or and he's having severe headache and weakness and with persistent nausea and vomiting. Thank you. Next slide. So It can be due to meningeal irritation. It can be raised ICT. It can be even due to anxiety. It can be due to it can be a combination of everything. So the primary diagnosis would be raised ICT. Next slide. So what would be the drug of choice? As we mentioned before, for raised ICT, what would be used?
Mannitol.
Mannitol and steroids. Yeah, high dose of steroids can be used. The same person, no chemotherapy, nothing, again reports dizziness and vertigo along with vomiting, and any head movement causes vomiting. So which center would be involved?
Vestibular.
Yeah, vestibular center. Next slide. So which are the receptors? Histaminic and muscarinic. So we need to give any anticholinergic or antihistaminic drugs, usually the promethazine or prochlorperazine or cyclizine. Next slide. So this patient, we have given him morphine on every 4 hours for his pain, and he's telling you, I have early satiety, I feel full and bloating sensation. Next slide. So opioids can act in, I have mentioned the receptors, CTZ, dopamine, serotonin and neurokinin 1. Opioids are very well known to cause gastric stasis, so you actually need a prokinetic agent there. Next slide. Haloperidol is a very strong D2 receptor antagonist, but the commonly used drug would be, because there are a lot of evidences for metoclopramide than that of haloperidol, although haloperidol can be more potent in terms of opioid-induced vomiting. And if it is really troublesome, some patients don't get any relief with all these drugs, you can actually think about rotating the opioid. Next slide. Again, he's telling that I have pain in the right upper abdomen, continuous pain, and I have increase in pain on deep inspiration, and there is loss of appetite. What can be the reason?
Hepatic capsule.
Yeah,
Liver.
so he may have liver, he may have hepatic he may have a hepatomegaly, and which is causing all these symptoms. So the drug of choice would be, next slide. Drug of choice would be for the previous one, for the hepatomegaly.
Steroids.
You can use steroids so that it will reduce the peritumor edema or the capsular stretch for some period of time and reduce the symptoms. And it can actually reduce the pain also. Next slide. So this patient has a history of heart disease on aspirin, and he's telling epigastric pain with persistent nausea and vomiting, which may be very common. So it can be due to gastric irritation. So you have to give appropriate the gastroprotective drugs when he's not taking it. Next slide. History of fever and diarrhea. So this shows that he may have an infection. So it's important to treat the infection. The symptom is the same. He's coming with vomiting. When you ask for more and when you examine more, you understand that he has fever and diarrhea. Next slide. The last scenario would be, he's telling you, I have sore mouth, loss of taste, and I don't feel like eating anything, and with persistent vomiting. The last one, who would like to answer that?
Stomatitis and candidiasis.
Stomatitis. Very commonly, it is candidiasis. People tell you all these symptoms. It can be infected ulcer, stomatitis, or candidiasis. So, so this is the same person complaining to you that I have persistent vomiting. If you right away prescribe a drug, the moment you hear vomiting, the word vomiting, the right away prescribe the drug, you are not going to block, or you are not going to help him actually. So you need to understand what exactly he's telling, what kind of vomiting, why he is vomiting, what are the receptors involved. I hope I have at least conveyed that, although I have not conveyed about receptors and centers. Next slide. So to summarize, it is very important to understand the likely cause of nausea and vomiting, which pathway is involved, which is causing the vomiting reflex, which is a neurotransmitter involved, and which is the most potent antagonist, which is the receptor involved. What is the route of administration that we need? usually we have to exclude the oral route. Next slide. Titrating the dose carefully, review and give the antiemetic regularly. As in pain medication, round the clock medication is really important in terms of nausea and vomiting management also. Give it regularly. If the symptoms are persisting, you have to look for another causes. Maybe another, for example, opioid. He's not tolerating morphine at all due to consistent vomiting. We may have to think about an alternative treatment. And when you combine antiemetics, look for potential drug interactions. For example, do not combine a prokinetic with the anticholinergic or antimuscarinic drug. We never combine metoclopramide with Buscopan because both has opposite action. So it's really important to look for potential drug interactions when you combine antiemetics. It is okay to combine antiemetics, but just look where they act, whether one thing is helping the other or one thing is actually inhibiting the action of the other. I think that was the last slide. Yeah, there is no thank you slide.
Thank you. Sridevi. So anybody, if you have any doubts, please ask now.
In movement motion sickness, what kind of drugs can we use? What can we use, and can you tell me the dose for that, madam?
So usually the vestibular or movement-induced nausea and vomiting, the commonly involved receptors would be histaminic and cholinergic receptors. Usually promethazine is most commonly used drug, or any antihistamines like cyclizine. The dose, the drug, everything is mentioned in the slide, which I have gone through. All the drugs, which receptors in vestibular center, and what to block, what dose to be given. So I'll be sharing that slide.
Okay, like promethazine can be used, and then how about I heard about hyoscine patch, like that kind of thing. Would it works in your opinion?
What drug? Hyoscine?
Yeah, hyoscine patch, something like that.
Hyoscine patch, I have not used. I don't have any experience with hyoscine patch. I have heard about I think cyclizine patch, but that is not in our country. Sir, have you heard about hyoscine patch? I have not used. I don't have any experience with that.
No, I haven't heard. So I thought, yeah, I'm having a motion sickness. That's why I was asking you more. Yeah.
Okay. So the usually patients get good relief with promethazine. The commonly used one would be the Avomin, I think, or prochlorperazine, which is the Stemetil. Sir, you are about to tell something.
There are cyclizine is not available to us, but the commonly used ones are promethazine and prochlorperazine. I haven't heard about there is patch, but it is hyoscine hydrobromide, which is also not available in India.
Oh, okay.
I have heard about these patches only from people traveling outside India. They have come with the cyclizine patches behind the ear when they fly in the plane and stuff. So they don't have vomiting, but I have not seen it.
Okay. Yeah.
Scopolamine patch. That's what hyoscine hydrobromide.
Oh.
Anybody else?
If it is some psychological factor causing the vomiting, should we go for medications or try non-pharmacological methods?
So any nausea and vomiting, it should be accompanied with non-pharmacological measures also. So for example, you give chemotherapy and the patient is vomiting. You have given a good antiemetic. You have given ondansetron or granisetron. And coming back home, you have some unpleasant smell coming from the home, or you have something on your plate which you don't want to eat, or you have a foul smelling ulcer. No matter what medication you give, it's really important to go through the non-pharmacological manners, irrespective of you give the drugs or not. Along with that, the non-pharmacological measures is really, really important, because that plays a major role. That's why I put it in the beginning, because we have a tendency to jump into the drugs, but psychological factors play a major role. Even for us, we think about something which we don't like to eat, you feel nauseous, right? Or when you eat, people talk something about which you don't want to hear while eating, you feel nauseous. So psychological factors play a really important role, and non-drug measures also to be tried. All the non-drug measures, calm environment, distractions, good smell, avoiding the foul smell, clean, hygiene, everything is important.
When patients have nausea, they will have difficulty in taking the medicine. Should we resort to an IV route?
So that is why I've mentioned choosing the appropriate route is also really important. So suppose your patient is taking morphine, good pain relief with morphine, suddenly he went for chemotherapy, coming back with severe nausea and vomiting. So what happens, his pain suddenly increases because he's vomiting whatever morphine you are giving. The moment he takes morphine, he is vomiting it out. So he's not getting literally any pain medication. So you really have to change the route of administration, not just the antiemetics, but also for the other medications. So if the patient is in hospital, of course, you can try IV medication, or in palliative care setting, we do prefer subcutaneous medications because it is there are a lot of pros for using subcutaneous medications. It can be done at home also. Sometimes people many times I have seen people changing from morphine to fentanyl patches because that they cannot swallow, or there is no other way that they can be at hospital, and there is no other way that they can be given any other. So choosing the route of administration is really important. There are many mouth dissolving or sublingual absorbing tablets which are available. For most commonly used drug in our setting would be metoclopramide, which can be given subcutaneously. So when someone is really vomiting, we don't give it orally. We give it either subcutaneously or intravenously, depending on the setting.
Regarding ondansetron, should we start at a 4 mg dose or 8 mg?
Ondansetron, it has an anticholinergic effect also. So when it comes to palliative care patients, they already will have a lot of issues with the bowel opening, the gastric stasis. Most of the drugs can cause all this. So as it has a tendency to cause constipation, we usually start with a lower dose, to start with 4 milligram and then go higher.
Okay.
Madam, dexamethasone is a major drug used in many scenarios. And anything to consider if the patient is diabetic?
Yeah, that is a very valuable question. We use a lot of dexamethasone, and many of the patients would be diabetic, or we can induce diabetes. So for patients using doses like 8 milligram or 16 milligram, or I think anywhere from 8 milligram, if you are planning to continue it for more than 3 days, we do check the blood sugar regularly. You have to keep a track of blood sugar, and if the patient is developing higher blood sugar levels, you really have to weigh what is the condition of the patient, whether this dexamethasone is actually helping the patient. Most often this is the only drug which would have given good pain relief or good relief from the vomiting, so you cannot literally stop the steroid. So we really have to manage the diabetes really well. For the existing diabetic patients, we do the blood sugar more strictly, usually regularly, like 3 times or 2 times a day, every day. For non-diabetic patients, you can do it every 3rd day. So it's really important to keep a track of diabetes. It's not a written rule that every day, 3rd day or 2 times, but that is what logically we can follow. If we are planning to give it for a longer term, it is really important to track diabetes level. And non-diabetic patients, very thorough checking is needed, especially from when you give 8 milligram and you have covered 3 days, patient is prone to diabetes. Definitely, you have to keep a track of dexamethasone, the blood sugar levels, and you have to weigh whether you actually want to start an anti-diabetic medication, or what is the benefit of giving dexamethasone, and what exactly the patient is getting from the dexamethasone. Is it really needed? Can we stop it? Can we taper it? So all sorts of discussions have to be done before thinking whether you need to continue this or to stop this. But it's a very common problem.
Okay.
And another thing is you need to give dexamethasone only once daily and mostly in the morning. It has a longer duration of action, 36 to 54 hours. So usually what is seen is it is given as a TID dose. So it is not needed, and if you give it at night time, it can also produce insomnia. So it is advisable to give it as a once daily dose. And also from the HPA axis suppression point of view also.
Madam, in pregnancy who have morning sickness like that, are we going to give centrally acting, or is there any kind of drugs that we give specifically for morning sickness like that in pregnancy?
I don't have any experience to to answer that question because I've not dealt with that. Sir, if you would want to pitch in.
It is not the usual drugs that is given in pregnancy-induced vomiting. It is methyl. I don't remember the medicine which is given. It is something starting with the methyl something. Anybody of this group know about this?
I think we had the same question for the last Friday session. Someone from the group asked, but we had a gynecologist in the group, Dr. Kavita, so she answered the question. It's not something that we come across really common.
Pyridoxine.
Not pyridoxine. It's something else.
I remember the gynecologist telling that to try with the non-pharmacological measures first, and then start choosing the drug.
Yeah. Pyridoxine is one. I am just googling and see that pyridoxine and doxylamine. Yeah, doxylamine with pyridoxine. That's what usually given.
Okay. Okay.
Shall we move on to patient story? So which will be presented by Dr. Sinjita.
Can you hear me? Doctor, can you speak again? Seems like your voice is breaking.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, fine. Then we'll start. Can I start the presentation?
Yes, you can.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm Dr. Sinjita, junior assistant from the Department of PMR. So next slide. So here I'm going to present a case of a 62-year-old male patient who's admitted in our department, and his diagnosis was motor neuron disease with a comorbidity of type 2 diabetes mellitus and diabetic nephropathy. And his presenting complaints was he presented with the weakness of right upper limb and wasting of right upper arm muscles for past 4 months associated with weakness of both lower limbs. Then coming to the history, the weakness of the lower limb started 4 months back. He was apparently normal before that, and the weakness was gradual in onset, progressing in nature, which caused difficulty in walking due to the buckling of knees and had a history of frequent falls. And he neglected the symptoms initially. Then he started to notice weakness of gripping in objects with the right hand. Then he consulted the doctor. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Then he started to notice the weakness of the gripping of objects with the right hand. Then he consulted the doctor, and he was advised to have a cervical imaging, and he was reported to have a compression of the spinal cord at the cervical level, causing the symptoms. Then some medications was given, but in spite of the medications, his symptoms progressed, and he then started to notice the wasting of muscles of the right upper arm, and also he noticed twitching of the affected muscles. and further follow-up was interrupted due to the COVID lockdown. And he's also a non-case of type 2 diabetes mellitus for past 25 years, and also has a complaint of diabetic nephropathy. Next slide. And coming to the examination, on general examination, he had abrasions of a left arm due to the recurrent falls in the forearm, bilateral knees, and shank. Then right arm appears to be wasted, and in bilateral eyes, he had immature senile cataract. Then coming to the cardiovascular system examination and per-abdomen examination, it was with the normal limits. And coming to the respiratory system, his single breath count was 15 only, and then chest expansion was 1 centimeter. Then coming to the central nervous system examination, his higher mental functions were completely normal, cranial nerves were normal. And coming to the motor system examination, the bulk of the right arm and forearm were 2 centimeter less compared to the 2 centimeter less in the right compared to the left, and his tone was normal. Then power, coming to the power, the right shoulder, elbow, and wrist has reduced power compared to the left. Then his hand grip is weak in the right. Then coming to the lower limb, his bilateral hip abduction, knee extension power was reduced. Also, ankle power was reduced bilaterally with the tender Achilles tightness. Then deep tendon reflexes were absent in the right tricep jerk was absent, but exaggerated with bilateral knee jerk and ankle jerk. And plantar was bilateral flexor response, and he has no sensory deficits. Then coming to the treatment and significant investigations, the significant investigations was EMG and NCS, which showed the features suggesting of motor neuron disease. And he was on tauprazosin for hypertension, then also atava for hyperlipidemia. Then he also had insulin for the control of diabetic status. Then coming to the psychological aspect, he's married, living with his wife in his own house, which is vehicle accessible, and he has 2 children. They are all married off. Then he studied till 10th standard, and he is a manual laborer, and also he does agricultural activities at his home premises itself. Next slide. Then coming to the medications, apart from the regular medication for the diabetes and hypertension, then he was started on physiotherapy for strengthening and reconditioning exercises under a sub-fatigue level. Also, he was given gait training and balance training. Then coming to the main concern of the regarding the illness of the patient was that it is a new onset illness, which was his complaint started only 4 months back, and also the illness is progressive. And as we all know, the motor neuron disease has a poorer prognosis compared to the other diseases, and also it is progressive. So our main concern was how to break the bad news to him and his wife, because they seem to be highly optimistic, and also they expect a return to the normal health which he was in previously. And also we are concerned about his further complications and prevention during the progression of the disease. In coming to the summary, 62-year-old male with non-case of type 2 diabetes mellitus, diabetic nephropathy, and hypertension with complaint of weakness of right upper and bilateral lower limb for past 4 months associated with wasting of upper limb muscles. On examination showing decreased power of right upper limb, bilateral lower limb, wasting of right upper limb muscles, absent tricep jerk, exaggerated reflex of lower limb, and on evaluation diagnosed to have motor neuron disease. Then coming to the discussion points, we have to discuss about the early palliative care in motor neuron disease, and also economics of the treatment, and also how to deal with the psychological trauma or stress after revealing the patient about his disease and severity of the disease. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sinjita. So we have a 62-year-old man with motor neuron disease. So what was the reason for spinal cord compression? You were telling that imaging shows some compression at cervical region.
That was with a he was having a degenerative disc disease also.
Okay. So now he has wasting of upper limbs and yeah,
weakness of
both all the limbs, isn't it?
Yeah, no, left upper arm is almost spared.
Okay.
Bilateral lower limbs and right upper limb is involved.
Yeah. So, what exactly do you want to discuss in the early palliative care?
Yeah, early because actually motor neuron disease we rarely encounter the motor neuron disease, so we haven't got any opportunity to discuss about the palliative aspects of the motor neuron disease.
Okay. So, any of the participants would like to discuss what can be done in the early stages of motor neuron disease from a palliative care point of view? Anybody? Rija, would you like to comment on that?
I think the initial issue is telling him the diagnosis and explaining to him how the disease will progress. Have to gain the confidence of both the patient and his family members. Then we have to explain what are complications we are going to expect in this disease. It may hinder his ambulation, his communication, and his day-to-day activities of self-care. Slowly, he may have to become dependent on others for his day-to-day activities.
Okay. Thank you, Jijo. Those are important points. Sridevi, what would you like to add from a palliative care point of view in case of we need to give early palliative care?
So I think you have an added advantage of being the treating physician and understanding what palliative care is. The moment a true palliative care physician like us start talking to them about MND, they think that not going to die. So you are the treating physician and you have the upper hand in discussing what exactly it is. So like you might have heard in communication session, it's like that, following the spikes protocol. First of all, we need to understand what exactly motor neuron disease is. Many a times you might have heard, but as she said, we might not have encountered directly. And it's really important to understand how it is going to progress and what can be the problems that they are going to face. The main problem would be the psychological trauma to the patient as well as the family, because there is a on an informal note, there is a book called Tuesdays with Maury, which is about a person with motor neuron disease. So he described it as soul being trapped in the body. They will understand anything, everything, their cognition would be fine. They are the same person, but later on unable to talk, unable to eat, unable to cry, unable to express anything, and ultimately unable to breathe. So it's going to be a big psychological trauma for the patient, and it is really important to prepare the family now. And you have an added advantage that you are their treating physician. So when the treating physician is tuning them or conditioning them about the illness, it's really great. The ones who like we have, when we deal with these kind of patients, they don't take it really well, because they know that the treating doctor might be giving a lot of medications, and most of the medications have not proven to be successful in terms of managing MND. So they just believe that these people are lying, I'm not dying. Preparing the patient for all these loss of activities gradually. An informal advanced care planning would be one thing that I would like to do, because many a times, most often, these patients, when they develop difficulty in swallowing, they may undergo a lot of aspirations. And when the respiratory muscles start getting involved, they may end up in a ventilator, which is going to be a big problem. Once they put it in ventilator, the patient is going to be totally dependent, and the respiratory muscles are not going to come back. So an informal talk about advanced care planning is something which I would strongly recommend to do, because this, they have to understand this is an irreversible condition and there is no point in fighting It's not like there is nothing can be done. I'm not telling like that, but there are many things that we have to do to prepare them for the ultimate loss of whatever they are going to face. And it has to be explained really well. So for that, we need to understand what can be the stage of the illness, what are the muscles to be involved, what is the sequence, how long it is going to take, and the medications which is being prescribed in our country for so-called treatment of MND is really expensive. So there is a high chance that if we don't communicate it properly, they may end up in seeing another physician because the exercises or whatever you are giving is not working. I'm not walking. My hand is not coming back. My legs are not coming back. So I'm going to do for some other treatment. So they end up in having a lot of hospital shopping and loss of money. And I understand he's not from a very rich family. And another point is that I have a patient with MND. I have not seen him, but he's struggling to take injections regularly, which is highly expensive. And he invited me to join a group of people who have MND. And surprisingly, there were many of them. And I'm in a WhatsApp group where I have seen them discussing uh, issues like purchasing a ventilator at home, purchasing so many expensive things that they think is really going to help them. So the moment I start telling about the reality of the illness, they just don't want to listen to it because they really think that these drugs are going to work, and they know that it is irreversible. But all of them are purchasing many expensive equipment so that they can breathe, and they think that they don't think about the suffering that is going to come in days ahead. And most of them are in pain, and when they consult the neurologist, they say there is no reason MND can have pain. So most of them are not given any pain medications. So giving attention to the pain and related symptoms, communicating them, we ourselves getting the knowledge about MND properly, the sequence, and communicating step by step, and preparing them for the future. Ultimately, not in the first sitting. This may take several sittings, but these are the things that just come into my mind. And economics of treatment, yes, as I mentioned in the group, they are mentioning big things which I cannot even dream of buying. So they have an agent who supplies all these equipments, whatever they need, in a good bargain. So these are the realities that I am seeing being with a group of MND patients.
So one of the important thing would be Sridevi has mentioned most of the things, and I would like to add that one of the problem, as she described, would be the communication problem, unable to talk. Recently we had a patient who was unable to talk, but he was able to use his one of the I think some fingers were moving, and he was unable to express anything. So he was finding it very frustrating. Uh, so there are many things that can be done. Maybe I think you will be the better person because you will be using all this. Uh, you can use charts, or if the patient has eye movement, then you can ask them to close the eyes for yes and twice for no, things like that. So do you need water? If you want to say yes, you can close the eyes once, and if no, twice. So this is something that can be done. And maybe if you use the things like for meals, you can have a picture, or if you want to go to toilet or urinate, you can have separate pictures, and you can actually show this to the patient and point, so that patient can focus his eyes on the picture. And there are with the help of some IT personnel, designed a design something so that he can use his limbs to move move something which will write on the laptop. He can't type. So he can just move the no he was unable to move the limbs. He has to move the cursor with his mouth. So he will move the cursor with his mouth, and so that it will be typed in the laptop. So that's how he was communicating. Those are some innovative ways. And the most important thing would be making them understand that this is a progressive disease, and when the disease progress, how to move forward. Do you want to have a rice tube if you are unable to swallow? Or some many patients have used peg feeding. These are something which you can already discuss with the patient. Some of the patients they don't want to have artificial methods of feeding. Uh, and I don't know the evidence of feeding, artificial feeding in MND, but in dementia, it is seen that artificial methods of feeding will not do any good for the patient. It will not prolong the days that the patient is going to live. These are some serious issues which the people from palliative care can talk to the patient and go along with them till the end of the journey. So psychological stress, yeah, that would be the main thing for the patient as well as for the family. So as I told you, communication, we should focus on communication. Uh, so we have to find out the ways by which we can communicate with the patient. Anybody would like to add anything?
Sir, just to add to that, I think it's really, as you mentioned, the communication is really important in MND because no one else is going to tell them about the irreversibility of the illness. Most of them, and it is really difficult to communicate also. If it is cancer, people do understand what exactly cancer means. When you talk about MND, it's really difficult to make them understand what you're talking about because it's not that commonly heard or seen. So it's really important to spend time with them and ongoing communication sessions, and to be honest, so that because they may not get the right information from anyone else other than you, and the preparation and going along with them is really important. Preparation is the key for all this.
Okay, thank you, madam.
Sanjita, do you have any more questions?
Coming to the treatment, actually, I think riluzole can be given. So, is there any initiation from or any groups providing such tablets for the patients at a low cost or something like that?
In that group, I have seen people bargaining the price and stuff. But I'm not sure how far this riluzone after a particular point is going to help the patients with MND. So many of them might have progressed a little bit farther. Initial time it can delay, I guess, but most of the evidences are not really supportive of having actually any clinical benefit for the patient. But many of them stick on to the medication because they really think that it is going to be.
Okay.
But there are pharmaceutical companies which supply medications directly to the patient so that they get in a reduced price. But that is just going to eat up the family for quite some time.
Oh, okay, madam.
So thank you, Sridevi, for that wonderful session. And thank you, Sinjida, and all those who has participated for today's session. Thank you all. We'll see you next Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before you leave, please fill in this feedback questionnaire. I request all of you to please fill in this questionnaire so that we can improve our sessions. Please attend this questionnaire before you leave.
Thank you all. We'll see you next Thursday. Bye.